Uh, welcome. Muted. Welcome. I'm Wendy Goldberg. I'm the Executive Director of Tri-Faith. Thank you all for being here. As we called this a VIP pre-salon event, there are certainly VIPs ahead of me. So I want to start by thanking all of you who make this work possible. Our relationships are possible because we've come to know each other and care about each other and to deepen our faith. And I believe that this conversation tonight will bring us closer to that. In light of that, I thought I would offer just a teeny little centering thought from our good friend, Margaret Wheatley, who came to visit us last year. And it's from the book, Turning to One Another. Conversation is a natural way we humans think together. To advance human conversation as the means to restore hope to a future is as simple as I can get. When a community of people discovers that they share a common concern, a change begins. There is no power for change greater than a community that discovers what it cares about. And I really thought, this is a hard conversation. And I'm really proud that Tri-Faith is a place that we can have those conversations and to honor that religion has, that our God has many names and that our religion has many ways to be practiced. And as we uncover what is disturbing about the topic this evening, we at the same time honor particularly our partners at Countryside and their path in their Christian way. And so we want to frame this conversation as an opening and a beginning to what is not a duplication of what we will do at 7. So we will do the actual introductions and some bios and such at 7. But I thought perhaps we would start, we'll just maybe quickly, Robbie, if you could just give a sentence or two about who you are, and then Guthrie will let you do the same, and then we'll kind of dive right into a good conversation.
Great. Well, thanks, Wendy, and thank you all for being here tonight. I really appreciate that opening about conversations and especially difficult conversations and thinking about kind of how we grow together. And I hope that that will be the experience tonight. So I am Robert Jones. I'm the CEO and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute in Washington, D.C. And we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization that conducts public opinion research at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. And I'm the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which is a book that is really part social science, part history, but also part memoir. I grew up as a white evangelical Southern Baptist in Mississippi. So I'm kind of bringing that life journey, into the work and kind of combining it with the kind of social science data that I kind of deal with on a day-to-day basis in my day job.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Guthrie Graves-Fitzsimmons, and first let me say what a huge fan of Tri-Faith I am. I had the chance to be a presenter at a shoulder-to-shoulder training for faith leaders that are countering anti-Muslim bigotry at Tri-Faith, and absolutely loved the experience and getting to be on your campus. And I know you all are actively involved in the work of Tri-Faith, and I just applaud everything you're doing. And I think it's important for what we're going to be talking about tonight, which is religious nationalism, and the work you're doing is confronting that through religious pluralism. I'm a fellow at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C., but I live in Louisville, Kentucky. So I'm a non-resident fellow at CAP, and I work with our Faith and Progressive Policy Initiative, where we're working on the separation of church and state as a policy issue. And then across all of the issues, the Center for American Progress works on, both domestic and foreign, to bring progressive faith voices to our nation's capital.
So this 20 so minutes that we have left here is a conversation for us to have. I have a few questions that I'm glad to prompt with, but if someone is ready to start to frame tonight's conversation, to ask any big or small question, I invite you to unmute yourself and Joanna.
Hi, I'm Joanna Alexander. I'm the cantor at Temple Israel on the Tri-Faith campus. Thank you so much for being here. I really like what you just said about confronting religious nationalism with religious pluralism. And I think that those words really frame kind of the question that has run through my head for a really long time, which is, as a pluralist, I want to make space for every person's understanding of their faith and their religion. And I'm really struggling with how to make the right kind of space for supporting people's religious journeys when the end of their journey would diminish my journey.
One of you want to jump in on that? Robbie, what do you think?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. Well, thank you, for that question and for the thoughtfulness behind it as well. I mean, I think it's worth kind of noting kind of where we are in our country's history. I think, and as a way of kind of understanding the arc, here, that I think one of the things to remember is that we are at a real tipping point in the country, and that is in terms of demographic and cultural change in the country. So, as recently as 10 years ago, the country was still majority white and Christian. So when Barack Obama was running for president in 2008, the country was 54% white and Christian. That number today is 44%, right? So just since 2008 and our current time, we've moved across this threshold of being a majority white Christian country to one that is no longer a majority white Christian country. And I think at the heart of really the visceral, things that we're seeing, the defensiveness, the anger, is really a question of ownership, right? Who owns the country? And I think that's that letting go process of white Christians, right, who have been so accustomed to owning the country, with this, especially white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christians, who just, for all of our country's history, right, this is the first generation that we really faced a demographic shift in the country where the reality of this is kind of, so people could play lip service to diversity and pluralism, right? I think in the past, knowing that white Christians still kind of had a lock on demographic power and cultural power in the country. But this generation is the first one where that, those words are really coming to have some teeth to them, and it's really going to mean something different. So, I think that just framing the whole thing and kind of realizing that's what it's about. And I think there's a reality here, and I mean, I'm speaking as a white Christian, where I don't think we're doing white Christians any favors by not naming what's happening in the clearest possible sense, and then helping us and them on that journey, right, of letting go. And it really is a matter of I mean, when I talk in Christian terms, it's really a matter of Christian hospitality is one way of thinking about it, right? Making room themselves, right? And no longer demanding to be, I talk sometimes about a table metaphor, no longer demanding to be the people who own the table and who sit at the head of the table and welcome other people as guests, right? But sitting on equal terms around a table where no one owns the table. And but I think that there is a kind of grieving process of letting go of this other vision of America that's really, but I think helping white Christians face that's what's happening, I think is really, really important.
On the issue of pluralism, I think a helpful metaphor that I've heard is your religious freedom. Religious freedom is a shield, not a sword. And another one, your freedom to swing your arms in when you start hitting somebody else. So we need to affirm the kind of positive values of religious freedom and religious pluralism, while also being clear that they shouldn't be used as justification to harm other people, or there are interdependent human rights of which religious freedom is one, but it is not one that kind of supersedes all others. And I think but framing it in a positive way rather than, attacking somebody else's place, but rather appealing to all people. And at the same time, we have to realize that we're not going to win over everybody, and that there are a lot of people maybe who, for the Christian nationalism they saw on display at the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, was a wake-up call. They maybe weren't aware of Christian nationalism before. And so there are opportunities to engage people while also not worrying about, every single person is not going to be won over.
So I'm curious how you define, if you can for me, because besides being shocked about, the insurrection and all of that symbolism that was used, and of course this has just been emerging, for several years now, but I'm curious how you define Christian nationalism. I'd like to hear that from you guys.
So that is one of the questions that will be unpacked in the main session, and it's actually how we'll begin. So if that is okay with you, could we take a different question, knowing that I don't want to spend our time answering now and then repeating again. But thank you for the question. It's nearly an opening question after 7. Thank you. Who else?
This isn't a question, and I'm fried having driven from Boston, so bear with me. One of the concerns I often have in our tri-faith community is, because I'm so anti-Christian nationalism, and I feel like, I was reared in a Christianity that is so the antithesis of my way or the highway, and this whole attitude we have in this country, but that we are careful in our language, in our conversations as tri-faith, to always understand that there are, just as there are so many faces of Judaism and so many faces of Islam, that Christianity is, oh my God, there are a lot of faces of Christianity. And so that we don't denigrate Christianity by what I would call our lowest common denominators, and that how do we speak about this in a way that elevates pluralism, because I do believe that is what our walks of faith are all about. Anyway, so that's just something I just contextually, I think we as tri-faith have to wrestle with.
Guthrie, could you start to that? Your book addresses this conversation.
I realized in my intro I forgot to mention I did just put out a book. I'm first-time author, so I'm not very good at remembering.
Good.
But in my book, I have a chapter on something I call the Westboro Baptist Church effect. Is a big pet peeve of mine, is how we do concentrate so much on the extremist forms of conservative Christianity, which we have to. And I've spent a lot of my career confronting, the far Christian right. And yet I was raised in a super progressive household. And, my pastor, when I was in high school, was Grand Marshal of Pride in Houston. And that was amazing for me coming out as a gay man. And so we have to talk about the diversity of Christianity. And then I was raised in a predominantly white church, and one of my earliest memories was going to a Black church where my parents were working, and, just being amazed by the worship style, and also the political nature of the Black church, where there was no question about getting involved in politics. I'm always so frustrated with predominantly white liberal churches that are sometimes, we don't want to get into politics, which is a choice for white churches, and Black churches are so engaged in activism for their survival. And so we need to understand the racial diversity, all forms of Christian diversity, which is not to look away from far right Christian nationalism or conservative Christianity, but it's to acknowledge and not give that brand too much of the attention.
So I think I'm going to be the yes and part of the conversation here. So yeah, I agree with this, and clearly, what has not gotten enough attention from journalists, from others, is telling this other story, right, of Christianity. Like, so, I still, and Guthrie and I have run in similar circles for a number of years, but I think both of us kind of have this collective, head on the hand when we see stories that imply that all Christians are anti-gay, or that LGBTQ rights is about religious people versus secular people, or those kinds of lines, forgetting that there are these Christian traditions like the UCC or the Episcopal Church, or that have had decades of support, for LGBTQ rights, and are still on a journey, there of adapting and learning. At the same time, one of the things that I think I've been trying to hold up, particularly for, and I'll say we white Christians, is the impact that race and white supremacy has had, even on the more progressive strains of American Christianity. And I think that's a tougher conversation. And I'll, in terms of white, and I usually, we'll get in this in a minute, but I always try to use white Christian nationalism when I'm talking about this. It really is the kind of the toxicity of white supremacy married to Christianity that really is what we're talking about. And what we see, though, some maybe shocking to know that, or not shocking to know, that 81% of white evangelicals, for example, voted for Trump in the last election. But so did nearly 6 in 10 white Catholics, and so did nearly 6 in 10 white mainline Protestant Christians, right? Episcopalians, Presbyterians, UCC, American Baptists, and those are fairly high correlates to where they score on something I developed in the book called a racism index, which is attitudes around systemic racism. White evangelicals score 8 out of 10 on this racism index, and white mainline Protestants and white Catholics score 7 out of 10. So it's a challenge, right? To not paint everybody with the same brush, and at the same time hold up the mirror in places where you might think, people, might get a pass.
Fair.
Another question?
And maybe you're going to discuss this at 7, but I think one of the challenges I see is how to have these conversations and what is effective means of communication with people. I mean, because there's just no denying that this using religion as a bludgeon was part of our founding. I mean, it's been there from the beginning and is so deeply embedded in our prejudices. So, but how do you most effectively have those conversations with people? Because facts don't seem to be all that prevalent or useful anymore. How do you change minds?
Well, I would just add, and I am an optimist by nature, that talking about the fullness of our history, both the ideals that we can call people to uphold and form a more perfect union, does not detract from the evils and failures of our predecessors. So when I mention an appeal to Thomas Jefferson's call for religious freedom, that's not to look away at the harms Jefferson has done, but there is a commitment to religious freedom that we have always failed up to living, but also strived for in American history. And that's not something I don't think, at least, it's something to be cast aside as, we've never lived up to that. It is something we have aspired to as a nation. And we're trying, through each passing generation to do our part to more fully live up to it.
So I'll just add, and this is maybe my part where I get to say thank you to Tri-Faith and all that it's doing, because I think it's going to get changed in local communities on the ground, right? I don't think we're not going to do it on social media. We're not going to do it, by whoever the talking head is on CNN is not going to do it. Biden's not going to do it, by talking about unity. I mean, it really is going to be, what really changes hearts and minds are relationships, right? I mean, I certainly know in my life when I've changed my mind about something, it's been because somebody I respect and love has a different view than I do, right? I take that seriously because of the person that I know them to be. So the work that I think Tri-Faith and on the ground is doing to kind of bring people together across lines of difference, I think that's where the change begins to happen. And because it really does take being in relationship and proximity to people, I think, to kind of get beyond some of these bubbles. And I'm really convinced that, like, one of the reasons why these kind of QAnon conspiracies and all that have flourished even more than they, I think, usually do is because the pandemic is ripe for that kind of thing, right? People don't have interactions with people. We're all kind of confined, and so you go down the rabbit hole, on some online site, and you're kind of stuck. But I think the kind of real life, face to face. I know you're all having to do virtual stuff, but eventually we'll get back to face to face. But that civic fabric, building that civic fabric, I think, and there's so few places doing that. I think that's the really important thing to note here. Last time we asked about people's social networks, we found like really shocking levels of social segregation. Like, so your average white person's core friendship network, for example, is 93% white, right? And 75% of white Americans say they have absolutely no non-white person in their closest, friendship network. So when you get that, and we're segregated like that by party, by religion as well. So it's maybe no surprise we have such trouble, right? When we're having trouble getting across these lines on a really personal level.
And the personal level, I also think, has to extend to policy change. My church here in Louisville Baptist Church, we have an anti-racism team. We're still a predominantly white church. We're actively working with Black Lives Matter Louisville and have been trying to be present in the Breonna Taylor protests here. And yet we have policy racism, and Louisville is one of the most segregated cities in the country. And so it's I think, through relationship and then also looking at the structures that keep people apart. And Christian nationalism is both, and maybe we'll get more into this in the full session, but it's beyond the kind of like individuals who are insurrectionists who cite Christianity. It's a system that privileges Christians in our society, and there are policy implications there too.
Perhaps one last question before we go into the full session. I'll ask a question that was, oh, go ahead.
I think part of what the question, for some folks is also family dynamics and how that plays a part in those conversations and those difficult conversations. And that's certainly true in extremists in every religion. But, I know, personally in my situation, I have folks in my own family that subscribe to things that I just do not agree with from a nationalist standpoint. And those conversations can be really separating and difficult. And, finding ways to have that common ground of love to be able to talk isn't always possible.
Robbie, do you have anything to offer in terms of the statistics around that?
I'm trying to think about, the main thing actually is not statistics, but I resonate with that really strongly. My family's from the Deep South. So I've got my sister on one side, my brother on the other, my dad on one side, and my mom on the other. That's how, and at Thanksgiving, my nephew, in 2016, actually, when during that election year, at Thanksgiving, my nephew tried to preempt a fight at the Thanksgiving table by saying, "I'll do the prayer," and jumped up and said, "I want to thank you, God, that we can have Thanksgiving dinner without it breaking down into an argument over politics." So it's there. But I would say this: I think that your presence is a really important anchor, right? Even if you're not talking about politics. But I think just the connection, I think about that, with my own family, that I think in many ways, because the problem is, I think if you just get surrounded by only people who believe what you believe it, and I think it's often, I mean, frankly, I think my connection to them is a good check for me as well, right? To kind of, that I'm really understanding something about, I'm not just reading in a book or an article, but I'm really understanding this view that I have a hard time wrapping my head around. But I think that anchor point again of relationship on the long haul is pretty important going forward.
I would say there are some examples we can draw on from LGBTQ people. I'm just thinking about my own experience of coming out to family members who, protested our wedding, my husband and I's wedding, in essence, by not coming, and, having these really tough conversations about, this is part of who I am. And, having a family member say, well, I think if I go to your wedding, that will compromise my eternal salvation, and, I'll be kicked out of my church, and all, really tough conversations. But that to me is much better than the kind of unity, the false unity of let's just not talk about it. And it's, at some point you have to kind of force the question, and that's not the same in every context. But I do think there is something to be had in, like cousins that are open about their support for Trump, for instance, and actually talking about it in a way that is maybe uncomfortable, but at least, people can share what they're feeling. And as Robbie said earlier, your greatest sphere of influence is in your family. So when we talk about how to change and persuade and talk about these really tough issues, I think we have to look around us first before we, yell something out, on the internet, or do something that we think is going to reach people. So I encourage tough but holy and hopefully life-giving conversations. And hopefully we can help equip everybody tonight to have those, about white Christian nationalism.
Great. What a wonderful entry into us letting the rest of the people in the room. Thank you all for showing up to have this first conversation with